A man worries about the future until, a woman worries about the future until she gets a husband. A man never worries about the future until he gets a wife. A successful man is one who makes more money than his wife can spend. A successful woman is one who can find such a man. To be happy with a man, you must understand him a lot and love him a little. To be happy with a woman, you must love her a lot and not try to understand her at all. I want to read to you some thoughts of a brother and a sister in Christ in regard to the subject of remarriage. She sent me this email on July 30th of 2016. This was 2.5 years after her loss. Her husband passed away about 6 weeks before my wife did. He was in his mid-40s. He went downstairs to exercise. It was Sunday morning, and his wife was preparing breakfast. She sent her 13-year-old teenage daughter to go down to get her dad, and she found him dead. This is 2.5 years after that loss. I asked her to send me her thinking about remarriage. First of all, it scares me to think about the whole experience of dating and just starting over. I'm not sure I can love someone like I loved Gary. I am very lonely and miss his companionship every day. We talked about it before. You know, if something happens to one of us that we would want the other to remarry, it was easy to say that when he was here, but now he is gone. That's much more difficult to talk about now. I would like to be able to love again, but I am not sure that my heart is ready or my heart would be able to handle that again. It also scares me because I know if I get married again, that my spouse might die before me again. I don't want to have to live through this pain of losing a spouse again. I don't know if I can do it again. Dave is a brother in Christ who's 58 years old. His wife was a church secretary and a very important member of the Lord's Church in Massillon, Ohio. I asked him to tell me something about remarriage, his thoughts about remarriage, and he chose to do it in this personal way. He said, my mother-in-law, in talking about her remarriage, greatly distressed my wife, even to the point that it affected our visits with my mother-in-law. They were usually very brief, and Joyce was very short with Tony. She made it clear that she didn't like him. I never knew why. To me, he was tolerable, and he was good for my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law is not a Christian. In the case of my dad, he asked both me and my brother if it was okay for him to date and then to marry. My problem with my dad's wife is that she's not a Christian, and it has affected his life. Yes, she is very good to him, and with him having a stroke, I'm glad she's so good to him. Otherwise, he'd have to be in a nursing care facility. My brother and I could not have taken as good a care of him. But going back to his life since remarriage, having married her, he attended services now less often. He goes away on weekends. He misses church services that he would have never missed with my mother. My coolness, and initially my brother's, affected family gatherings. She sensed that Joyce and I didn't care for her. That was only because of how his church life had been affected by his remarriage. For the most part now, we keep our distance. A preacher friend of mine up in northeast Tennessee told me about this particular situation. He said, my dad died in 2013. There was a man at my mom's church whose wife died the day before my dad died. He took care of his wife for 12 years. I performed the ceremony for that man and my mom last April. Mom is 88 and he is 78. I've seen some really neat stories, really neat positive stories that have been shared with me about remarriage. I have also had stories told to me, and I know of stories that are very, very sad stories. That's one of the reasons why I thought this subject really needed to be addressed. And I'd like to ask you to think about a few things in regard to that subject. I think the biggest thing to consider for a widower remarrying are some of the things that I'm going to share with you in this lesson. One of the things we have to realize is that there are myths about marriage. I'm not talking about remarriage. There are myths about marriage. You may have even come to realize this by personal experience. I hope not, but maybe so. Bill and Lynn Hybels, they're not members of the Lord's Church. I think they're still in Chicago, Illinois, wrote an outstanding book called Fit to be Tied. As a matter of fact, if you know of anybody, or even a teenager, an older teenager, or a young adult who hasn't yet married, it'd be a great book for them to read. It is the book that I have used in premarital counseling for a number of years. They really talk about a lot of things that are very important that a person ought to think about and talk about before they ever get married in the first place. And when I started looking at this subject of remarriage for the widowed people, I thought, you know what? One of the things you need to do is go back to the fundamentals. And I think the Hybels couple in this book have really hit on a lot of things that ought to be mentioned, not just previous to somebody's first marriage when they're young, but also in regard to remarriage. Here are some myths. Marriage will end my aloneness. Marriage will heal my brokenness. Marriage will ensure my happiness. Marriage is God's plan for everyone. Have you noticed, I bet some of you ladies, maybe the boy you were dating was a pretty unkept fella. You know, he wasn't very organized and kind of lived a disheveled life. Did you honestly think, don't answer orally right here, did you honestly think because you stood in front of family and friends and you said, I do, that unkept person was going to become a cleaning freak and an organized person after he said, I do? That doesn't happen, does it? If a person is lazy before they get married, they're going to be lazy after they get married. We need to realize that marriage is not about trying to have a relationship with somebody so that you can change them. Because what you have to do is go into the relationship thinking they're going to be just like they are now. They're never going to change. If a person doesn't like the idea or is extremely uncomfortable with their boyfriend or girlfriend smoking, and if they say, well, I'm going to quit smoking whenever we get married, or they say, I'm going to start going to church with you after we get married, do you think saying I do is going to change that circumstance? If a person is an alone type person who is a lonely type person, marriage may not solve that loneliness. And if they're a very broken person because of what they've experienced in their life or their personal life or their family life, they're not going to be put together in good shape just because they said, I do. If they're an unhappy person before they get married, just because they get married doesn't mean they're going to be a happy person. And marriage is not God's plan for everyone. The most important characteristic for married people is spiritual compatibility. There is nothing more important than spiritual compatibility. It matters more than age. It matters more than personality. Two people who are spiritually compatible have two things that are extremely important. They have a common treasure, they share a common treasure, and they have a common blueprint. That is your trump card. I hesitate to use that terminology now since the election, but that is the trump card. That really is the trump card. Being spiritually compatible with that other individual. I can't imagine being married to somebody with whom you cannot share what you treasure most in your life. That blows my mind. I can't even think about that. I just can't imagine being married to somebody that the most important thing in your life, the Lord and His church, is something you can't share with that other person. Then think about the common blueprint. You know, you got issues and problems and struggles in the relationship. How are you going to handle those things? Where's your blueprint? Where's your guideline? You know, you got her perspective, you got his perspective. What about the Lord's perspective? Are both people going to be willing to honor the Lord's perspective about something that you're dealing with in your life? Well, if you're spiritually compatible, yes. But if you're not spiritually compatible, not so sure. There is nothing more important to contribute to the success and the fullness and the richness of a marriage more than spiritual compatibility. Bill and Lynn Hybels make the observation that this is the acid test of a relationship, time. During the 2014 calendar year, I can't tell you how many breakfasts I had at Bob Evans Restaurant in Alliance, Ohio, with a 29-year-old young lady who had lost her husband about 3 weeks before my wife died, when her mama came home and just collapsed and died suddenly in her early 50s. Her mother was not a Christian, nor was her father a Christian, but she was a Christian. She became a Christian in her late teens. Her father, after her mother died, got on the internet and found some woman up in Cleveland, Ohio, which is about an hour north of where they lived. And he started cultivating this relationship an hour distance away. And then you can imagine what impact that had on the 29-year-old young lady who was struggling with the grief process because she lost her mother. And now she's got her father self-medicating his grief by seeking out immediately, almost immediately, a relationship with another person from the opposite gender. And then after a few months, he brought her into the home in which this 29-year-old young lady grew up. And she sees her father replacing her mother with this woman that he didn't even know before her mother passed away. I had a lady by the name of Jean come to me in the church foyer, and she said, "Dean, I think I know what your answer is going to be, but I want to ask you anyway." She said, "Would you marry me and this other person?" And I asked her a few questions, and I said, "Jean, you know I love you, but no, I can't. I just can't conscientiously do that." She was a widow. She had lost her husband. Her husband was an electrician, a great electrician, but he got Alzheimer's, and that's what he eventually died of. And she cared for him at home for years. She was totally devoted to him and cared for him during all that awful experience of the Alzheimer's, and then he passed away. When he was buried, almost literally every day for months, she went and visited the place where he was buried. That was her therapy. That's the only way that she could survive. So after several months, she comes to me and asks me about officiating at this wedding ceremony between her and this fella that she went to school with when she was a kid. And I told her that I just couldn't do that, conscientiously do that. And I told her why, and she understood. That man withheld information from her about his health condition. After they had been married, shortly after they'd been married, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And not only did she care for him, but she lost literally everything she had in the way of finances whenever she remarried with him. And after he died, she had to move in to her daughter's home. Penniless. She didn't give herself enough time. She didn't give herself enough time to get to a point where the grief where she was in a better condition to make a wiser decision. I confess, I used to be a Facebook hater, but now I'm a Facebooker. On Facebook one day, I happened to notice this, that somebody posted. You have to be okay on your own before you can have a healthy relationship with another person. She hadn't gotten to that point yet. Nor had she given herself enough time to re-engage in a relationship with that man, to get that man to know, to get her to know what that man was like now. Have you ever run across somebody that you knew in elementary school that wasn't quite the same when they were 50 years old at the class reunion? You know, people change. You know, she thought in her naive condition, in her ignorance and inexperience, she didn't see a problem with what she was doing. But there was a serious problem. And it was really sad the day that she had to move in with her daughter because she had no other choice. I wish she had given herself more time, and I wish she had given herself more time in that relationship to get to know him. You know, you can fake who you are with another person, and you can do it for a while. You can play the Halloween thing. And there's going to come a time, though, eventually, where you're going to be able to see that person when they're mad, if you give it enough time. You're going to see that person and how they react and handle failure. You're going to see how that person reacts in regard to friction. Over a period of time, a person can't hide themselves. You kind of let down your hair. You know, you always are so prim and proper. My girlfriend was so long before she let me see her in curlers. Curlers were these round things with holes in them. I don't. The younger kids probably don't know what those are. But anyway, you know, we're so protective because we don't want a person to, if we're a female, we don't want to have them see us without our makeup or without our hair done. Over a period of time, you need to see the real person. The acid test of really any relationship is time. Whether you're talking about the initial marriage or you're talking about a remarriage, we need to give ourselves time in that relationship to really get to know that person. With a remarriage, you've got the blending of families. What's that going to be like? You know, most every family is different. And especially if there are children. Like Sister Buffy down there in Columbus, Georgia, she has one child. She's 32 years old now. She's dating this young man up in Kentucky. A long-distance relationship is probably a good thing for her right now. She does certainly feel a need to remarry. And the Bible says in 1 Timothy chapter 5, younger widows ought to remarry. That encouragement is there in 1 Timothy 5. And I'm sure that she will at some point in time. But she's going to be blending her family with her little boy with this other man. When you have two adults who both have children, they may be smaller children or they may be older adult children. You're going to be blending those families. And how are you going to do that? That needs to be discussed ahead of time. It's not something that ought to be thought about afterwards. It ought to be discussed ahead of time. And how do you blend two families? And there's some really good books about blending of families and what are called blended families and some advice about how to do that. But there's a lot of that kind of work that needs to be done before a person would choose to remarry. How are you going to handle that? It's something that needs to be considered and thought about. What about expectations? Expectations are impacted by your past experience. If in your previous marriage, your wife did the coffee in the morning while you laid in bed and waited for the coffee to get done, but then the morning after you're married the second time, she had a marriage where he got up and did the coffee while she stayed in bed, that's a minor expectation, but that's simply a sample. There are much larger things. What are the expectations? The expectations are often impacted by what we've experienced in the past. And a lot of times in remarriage, a person can be driven by the concept of replacement. And I would really discourage anybody from thinking about remarriage in that way. If I were ever to get remarried, there's no way I could replace Ruth Ann. There's no way I could do that. There's no woman on the face of the earth that could replace her. It's not a replacement. It is a brand spanking new and totally different relationship when that person remarries. So we have to realize that we have those expectations. Well, what are those expectations? Those expectations are something that ought to be talked about. What was the last marriage? What was the previous marriage like? How was that? What were the strengths? What were the weaknesses? What were the things that were frustrating or caused you to be fearful or upset? Those are issues that ought to be discussed. Expectations are a major concern to think about. What about health and things like sex? Those are things that ought to be discussed. One of the most important things in a marriage, in a transition into a first marriage or a transition into a remarriage, is transparency, being totally transparent. When I was church shopping, I was looking for some church that would be willing to accept a widowed preacher, which, by the way, is a pretty good challenge. One of the things I would do is I would take with me, like I'd have the pictorial Hartville church directory, and I'd offer it to them. They could call anybody they wanted to. I took my last colonoscopy report. Hey, I'm not kidding. I'm serious. I had the CD too, if they wanted to see that. But I had the letter from the doctor about that. I had my credit score, and I was trying to be transparent. I wanted them to know anything that they wanted to know about me. Well, it's way more important when you're transitioning into a marriage relationship, whether it's a first one or a remarriage. By the way, I know a lady in Hartville, Ohio that's been wed 3 times. She's been widowed 3 times. That just dawned on me. But what about discussions in regard to health? If you have concerns or you have some diagnoses in the past, those things certainly ought to be shared, shouldn't they? And then the obvious subject of the sexual interest or the sexual needs. What about finances? What about financial goals? What about the accounts that you have in your possession? What about budgets? And I can't tell you for how many years I have badmouthed prenuptial agreements. I have always said that they are like programming yourself for marital failure. However, in regard to a remarriage, I can see the possibility of that something that ought to be considered, maybe. Given what you're talking about, the total picture, given the children, the age of the children, given the resources and all of that sort of thing, for the sake of especially older teens or adult children, that might be something to even discuss and think about. And what about debt? And what about insurances? What about estate? What about inheritance? Those are things that also ought to be discussed to be transparent with that other individual. What about residence? Which one are you going to live in? Are you going to live in both? Where are you going to live? Are you going to sell? Are you going to buy? You know, it's easy to assume that that other person is thinking like you because you're thinking right? I mean, don't we always think right? So the way we think is the way it ought to be. Well, how about thinking about the residence? And what are we going to do about the residence? With any marriage, there's risks. None of us realize that when we get married. We're too young, we're too ignorant, and we're too naive. But the reality is, it's a risk factor when you get married. Because what you're doing is you're totally investing your life into this relationship over which you do not have total control. Again, it takes 2 to get married. It only takes 1 to end that marriage. By divorce or by death. And there are risk factors that we ought to realize. We do not have control over the marriage. We may be prepared to remarry. Is the other person, are you convinced that the other person is capable and ready to remarry? Because you do not have control over the marriage. you didn't have control over the first one. You may have thought you did, especially if you were a man. You thought you did, but you don't. You never do. It's a group of two. And with two, one does not have total control over a voluntary relationship. So we need to realize the risk factors when it comes to the marriage relationship. I like this comment. Remarriage at midlife or later is somewhat like the merger of two major corporations. Be wise in what you are doing. I was reading in this one book that made this observation. I'll bet Brother Olin has done this. Have you ever grafted in a tree? Have you ever grafted in I've read a little bit about grafting, and has anybody ever grafted into a tree? I've heard that takes time and attention. To graft into a tree takes a lot of time and effort and care. Okay, here you're taking two people and they're getting remarried and starting a brand new relationship. If you think grafting is hard, if you've ever tried to graft into a tree and you think that's hard, or you've ever thought about or been a participant in the merging of two corporations, think about two human beings who both have heads, minds, and hearts. And they're not in the same body, and everybody is different. It can be a very complicated and challenging experience. I couldn't help but be impressed with this one lady at the Germantown church outside of Memphis. She said, Dean, she said it so blunt. I love it. Widows and widowers are some of the most blunt people I've ever met in my life. They will say things to another widow or widower that I would hesitate to say in a larger group setting. But I'll repeat what she said because it's what she said, not what I said. But she said this was a lady who had lost her husband less than a year ago. And I was there the first weekend in November of last year. She said, Dean, she said, men are looking for a nurse and a purse. Oh. I said, oh. I just appreciated her bluntness. But she had known from her experience, from other friends that she had, that there are sometimes things that motivate a person to choose to remarry. That's why we need to take time to get to know that person and know their heart and know their thinking and know their circumstances. Because since marriage is always a risk, you can't eliminate risk, but what you can do is you can wisely do things to try to reduce the risks as much as you possibly can. That's what I would challenge a young person to do. If eventually you want to get married and you find somebody that you're interested in, you do everything you can to try to lessen the risks in that relationship and maximize the possibility of it being a rich, full, magnificent marriage. In my opinion, there are three kinds of marriages. There are miserable marriages. There are mediocre marriages. I think it's a shame that a Christian who has been bought by the blood of Jesus would settle for anything less than a magnificent marriage. I'm afraid that there are a lot of miserable and mediocre marriages. What we need to be shooting for as a Christian is we want to reflect the glory of God in that marriage relationship. So what we want to cultivate is the best, richest, fullest marriage that we possibly can. A magnificent marriage that brings glory and honor to God and is a tremendous blessing to us. And that ought to be our goal if we're marrying the first time or we choose to remarry. Thoughts, feelings, questions, maybe 5 minutes worth? How about some feedback? Let me read to you one quick comment while you're thinking if you want to mention something. Here's a note, an observation from Miriam Neff, who wrote a book called From One Widow to Another. She said, quote, they may be perceived, talking about the person that they're thinking about marrying, they may be perceived as potential caregivers, financial security, or someone to fill emptiness. When these are the predominant reasons for remarriage, unhappiness is on the way. So why do you want to be remarried? That's something that we ought to think about. I've discussed this subject with, is Melissa out? No, Melissa's here. My daughter's here. So I'll explain to her, if I ever choose to remarry, here's the way it's going to go. And she's going to have to agree to this, whoever that female is, if it ever happens. I think it's highly unlikely. But anyway, step number one, both of us have to talk to our children. Our children have to be all in the loop and buy in. Number two, we're going to go through professional counseling. We're going to do the work that anybody ought to do to invest into a relationship so valuable and so important. So in humility, we are both going to go to counseling. And then also, we're going to go to a financial planner. And we're going to get a third-party perspective about what we ought to do given our financial resources. We just need to be careful. We just need to be really careful. So, Melissa, brace yourself for when we discuss that issue. Yeah. Who? What'd you say? I said I think there's two others. Oh, okay. Yeah. Two of my children are the one I even referenced it in her wedding ceremony. I have one that's especially given to emotional extremes. The second one's not too far behind. So, yeah, that could be a real interesting conversation. By the way, let me tell you about the guy whose wife got really mad because he missed an anniversary. I mean, she was ticked off. I hope none of you men have ever missed an anniversary. And boy, she just lit into him. She pointed her finger at him and she said, "Honey, I cannot believe that you forgot our anniversary. Tomorrow morning when I wake up, I better see something out there in the driveway that goes from 0 to 200 in 6 seconds." The next morning she woke up. She looked out the window from the second story, and there was a red box out in the driveway. She went down, she opened that box, and there was a bathroom scale there. A red one that could go from 0 to 200 in less than 6 seconds. And Bob has not been seen in recent years. Any comment or observation? I'm so thankful for your time. I know everybody's busy, and you may have skipped your nap. If you take a nap this late, you may not be able to sleep tonight. Let me ask you for your help and your assistance. I really appreciate your prayers in regard to the Widowhood Workshop ministry. And if you could be of any help to me in letting other folks know in other places where you have connections that the Widowhood Workshop ministry exists. There is a website, and if you go out there on the table, there are I have 2 cards, one for the Murray City Church of Christ, where I am the local preacher, and then one separate one for the Widowhood Workshop ministry. And my son-in-law has developed a website where you can go and you can see a little bit about the Widowhood Workshop ministry. But I want to get the word out about the existence of this ministry. I'm willing to go anywhere, anytime. I am restricted in regard to my Sundays. Sometimes I'll do this on a Saturday. I mean, I'd be more than happy to go in the middle of the week somewhere or do a Monday night, Tuesday night thing. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that we can arrange this sort of thing. But if you know of any congregation that would be interested in a widowhood workshop, then I certainly will do everything I can in my power to work something out. Because I really do think that this is an area where we've not talked about this. I mean, I'm ashamed to admit that I was with that church at the 32-year mark, and it dawned on me. I had never once preached about widowhood. And I was ashamed of that. And I never had really taught a class about widowhood, except that passing reference in James 1:27 when you're doing a textual study of the book of James. I really think we can do better in the church. And I'm really committed to raising awareness about this issue and this life circumstance. And I'm telling you what, I'll tell you about this experience at the University City Church in Gainesville. I finished this one session, and during the course of that session, I mentioned something about widows and widowers not having leprosy. Some people are really hesitant to hang around widows and widowers. They're scared of us. And you know, I was trying to point out, we don't have, you can't get leprosy from hanging out with or shaking hands with or hugging a widow or a widower. This old fellow who's a retired elder came up to me after one of those sessions. He stuck out his hand, had a big grin on his face. He said, Brother Dean, I am so glad to hear that I don't have leprosy. But it is, you know, sometimes people don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. And so they have a tendency to shy away. Let me mention to you something. In 2 different books that I've noticed, in regard to the social network of a person who's lost a spouse, the typical experience, now this will blow you away. It did me. It shocked me. And I didn't believe it until I saw it the second time. In the social network of a person who's lost their spouse, typically that spouse will lose 75% of their social network when they've lost their spouse. Part of the reason why is because they don't know what to do with you. They're scared of you. One widow said, you can't catch death from hanging around us. But people, they really don't know how to interact. They think that they can't say anything about the person who's passed on, which is just the opposite is true. That widowed people want to talk about the person that they've lost and even the circumstances that were involved in the loss. It's a therapeutic thing. But we need to know more about how to engage with widowed people and what it's like and minister more effectively to the widowed people. It's a great way to glorify and honor God. Obviously, it's close to the heart of God, so shouldn't it be close to our heart as His children? So thank you very much for your attention today, and I'm just so thankful to be a part of this church today. Yes, sir.
I know you're an Ohio State fan.
Oh, big time.
You would come to Michigan.
Are you kidding me? I don't give a hoot for the whole state of Michigan, the whole state of Michigan, the whole state of Michigan. I don't give a hoot for the whole state of Michigan, because I'm from Ohio. I'm from Ohio, O-H. I'm from Ohio, I-O. I don't give a hoot for the whole state of Michigan, because I'm from Ohio. Thank you for the opportunity. I've never done that in public before. Hey, do you know the song, Oh My, It's Hard to Be Humble? Mac Davis, do you remember Mac Davis on TV? I love that song too. I won't sing that one to you, but I taught that song to my first grandchild. Oh my, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. Oh my, it's hard to be humble. I get better looking each day. To know me is to love me. I must be a whale of a woman. I was teaching my granddaughter. Oh my, it's hard to be humble, but I'm doing the best that I can. My granddaughter can still sing that song. Yeah. I'm like Woody Hayes. I'd never even buy gas up in Michigan.